A man shared his last meal with a starving bear. What she brought back shocked him. What would you do if you came face to face with a starving bear, desperate and on the edge of survival? Would fear take over, or would compassion lead your actions? When a lonely man in the Alaskan wilderness makes an unexpected choice, he unknowingly sets something extraordinary into motion. But nothing could prepare him for what the bear does next. Stay with us, this is a story you won't forget. Jack Turner sat at the edge of his small wooden porch, his breath misting in the freezing air as he chewed slowly on the last bite of his meager supper. The wind howled through the towering pines surrounding his cabin, rattling the old window panes and reminding him just how unforgiving the Alaskan wilderness could be. He ran his calloused fingers over the empty tin plate, scraping at the few remaining crumbs before setting it aside. The loneliness had settled in long ago, like the heavy snowdrifts that blanketed the ground. He had once been a man of routine, a park ranger devoted to the land, but since his wife had passed, each day blurred into the next, devoid of meaning. He had no one to share his words with, no warmth beyond the fire that crackled in his modest hearth. And now, with his supplies dwindling and game scarce this winter, even the simple comfort of food was slipping away. As he reached for his tin mug, the faintest sound caught his ear, a rustling, hesitant and measured, unlike the usual whisper of wind through the trees. His hands stilled. Years of experience in the wild had trained him to recognize the difference between the ordinary and the unnatural. And this was something watching. Slowly, he turned his gaze toward the tree line, where the shadows of dusk painted the snow in deep blues and grays. At first, he saw nothing, just the skeletal branches swaying against the bruised sky. But then, movement. A dark, lumbering shape emerged from the forest edge, cautious yet desperate. The bear was nothing more than skin and bone beneath her thick, unkempt coat. Her ribs jutted out beneath her fur, her breath coming in slow, labored puffs that curled in the cold. Jack didn't move, barely dared to breathe as he took in the sight before him. The animal was starving, her massive frame reduced to something frail and ghostly. Yet even in her hunger, she held herself with quiet dignity. He had seen bears before, plenty of them, but never one that looked quite like this, on the razor's edge between survival and the inevitable. She took another step forward, then hesitated, nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of what little food lingered in the air. Jack's instincts warred within him. A starving bear was dangerous, unpredictable. He should have reached for his rifle, should have scared her off before she decided to close the distance. And yet, he didn't. He only watched, heart pounding slow and steady, as an idea took root, one that went against every lesson he had been taught about life in the wild. Reaching beside him, he took the last strip of dried venison from his plate, turning it over in his fingers before extending his arm. The bear did not move, her dark eyes flickering between him and the offering, her great head tilting as if she too was weighing the risk. Jack swallowed. He could feel the hunger in her bones as much as he felt his own, a mirror of desperation they both shared. The cold was relentless, the land cruel, and there was no guarantee either of them would see the end of this winter. He knew what starvation looked like, what it did to the body, the mind. It had gnawed at him in different ways since the day he buried his wife beneath the frozen earth, leaving him hollow, a man who had once been whole. A moment stretched between them, silent and waiting. Then, slowly, the bear stepped forward, her massive paws pressing into the snow, crunching softly with each deliberate movement. Jack didn't flinch, didn't dare show fear, even as her towering form closed the space between them. Details now, the frost clinging to her whiskers, the small wound near her shoulder, the way her breath hitched as though even standing took effort. She stopped just a few feet away, her eyes locking onto his, and for the first time in years, Jack felt something stir in his chest that was neither grief nor exhaustion. It was recognition. The bear sniffed at the air once more before lowering her great head, her nose twitching as she took in the scent of the food in his outstretched hand. He could see the hesitation in her movements, the remnants of fear that had not yet been eroded by hunger. But then, as if some unseen decision was made between them, she leaned forward and took the strip of meat with surprising gentleness. Her lips brushed against his fingers, rough and warm, and then it was gone, swallowed in a single desperate bite. Jack exhaled, realizing only then that he had been holding his breath. For a long while, neither of them moved. The bear's dark eyes lingered on him, her breath coming in slow, measured puffs, as if waiting for something more. Jack had nothing left to give, only the quiet between them, the wind whistling through the trees, and the simple, unspoken understanding that had passed in that moment. She lingered for another second, then turned. Her massive form melted back into the trees, her steps slower now, her body still weighed down by hunger but carrying something else too, perhaps a flicker of trust, however small. Jack remained where he was, staring at the place where she had disappeared, his fingers still tingling from where her warmth had touched them. The night grew colder, and the sky stretched wide above him, infinite and unyielding. But for the first time in a long time, he did not feel entirely alone. Jack Turner awoke to the sound of the wind howling through the trees, a familiar symphony in the Alaskan wilderness. But something felt different. The air was thick with a strange anticipation, a presence lingering just beyond the threshold of his cabin. He sat up slowly, the wooden cot beneath him creaking in protest as he swung his feet onto the cold floorboards. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he pulled on his worn boots and shrugged into his heavy coat before stepping outside, greeted instantly by the biting chill of dawn. The sky was still painted in the deep hues of early morning, the sun a mere suggestion beyond the jagged peaks in the distance. But his attention was not on the landscape. His breath hitched as his gaze fell upon something near the porch steps. A fish. A large, silver-scaled salmon lay nestled in the snow, its body fresh and glistening with ice crystals, as if it had been pulled from the river only moments ago. Jack frowned, his mind sluggish as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He scanned the clearing, his trained eyes searching for any disturbance, any footprints or signs of movement. And then he saw her. At the edge of the tree line, half shrouded in the early morning mist, stood the bear. Her dark eyes locked onto his, watching, waiting. The same desperate creature he had encountered the night before, though something had shifted between them. She was no longer just a starving beast looking for food. There was an awareness in her now, a silent understanding that stretched across the distance between them. Jack's breath came in slow, measured puffs as he took a cautious step forward, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. The bear did not move, did not flinch. He knelt beside the salmon, fingers brushing against the ice-cold flesh before lifting it carefully in his hands. It was heavy, a generous offering. And the realization sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She had brought him food. Jack exhaled sharply, a strange mix of disbelief and awe settling over him. He had heard stories before, tales spun by old trappers and indigenous elders, of bears displaying acts of intelligence, even kindness. But to witness it firsthand, to be the recipient of such a gesture, felt almost surreal. He turned the fish over in his hand, still half expecting it to be some trick of his exhausted mind. But the weight was real. The chill seeped into his fingers, undeniable. He looked back up at the bear, his lips parting as if to say something, though what words could possibly fit this moment? "Thank you," he murmured, the sound barely above a whisper, carried away by the wind. The bear blinked slowly, her breath curling in the morning air like smoke. She did not linger. With a final glance, she turned, her massive form disappearing into the depths of the forest, leaving Jack standing there with a fresh salmon in his hands and a heart pounding with something he couldn't quite name. He took the fish inside, the warmth of the cabin wrapping around him as he set about preparing it on instinct, gutting and cleaning the salmon with practiced ease, though his mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the last 24 hours. He had spent years in these woods, long enough to know that nature did not operate on human sentimentality. Survival was brutal, unyielding. And yet, what had happened could not be explained away as mere coincidence. As the fish sizzled in the pan, filling the small cabin with the rich, smoky scent of cooking meat, Jack found himself glancing toward the window more times than he cared to admit, half expecting to see those dark eyes watching from the tree line. But the bear did not return. Not that day. Not the next. He continued his routine as best as he could, trapping small game, gathering what little winter forage remained. But the solitude felt heavier now, more present than before. The encounter with the bear had stirred something in him, an ache that had long been buried beneath layers of grief and isolation. It had been years since he had spoken to another soul for more than a few passing words at the ranger station. Years since he had felt anything beyond the numb routine of existence. But on the fourth day, she returned. Jack was outside, splitting firewood, when he sensed it, that familiar presence just beyond the edge of his awareness. He turned, and there she was, standing in the same place as before, her massive frame partially obscured by the frost-covered branches. This time, she did not come empty-handed. Another fish lay in the snow at her feet, and beside it, something unexpected, wild berries, their dark skins glistening against the white. Jack straightened, the axe in his hand suddenly feeling irrelevant as he took slow steps toward her. She did not move, only watched as he approached. He crouched, picking up the berries first, rolling them between his fingers before lifting his gaze to hers. There was no mistaking it now. This was not random. This was not survival instinct alone. This was trust. Jack swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat as he set the axe down and reached into his coat pocket. He had little to offer in return, but he pulled out the only thing he had, half a piece of dried bread, the last of what remained from his last supply run. It was not much, barely enough for a single bite, but he extended it toward her anyway, a silent acceptance of whatever strange, unspoken bond had formed between them. The bear took a cautious step forward. Then another. Her massive head lowered, her breath warm against his hand as she took the bread with the same careful gentleness as before. Something in Jack's chest cracked open, something that had been tightly wounded for too long. He let out a shaky breath, a sound that might have been a laugh if it weren't so heavy with emotion. He didn't know what he had expected when he first saw her that night, when he had extended that first offering. But he knew now that he had unknowingly set something in motion, something neither of them could turn away from. The bear lingered for a moment longer before retreating once more into the trees, leaving Jack standing there, holding wild berries in his palm, and staring after her like a man seeing the world for the first time. As the days passed, the pattern continued. The bear would come, bringing offerings from the land, fish, berries, even an old elk antler, as if testing the limits of their fragile understanding. Jack, in turn, would offer what he could, meager scraps of bread or pieces of smoked meat, always careful, always respectful. He spoke to her sometimes, not expecting a response but finding comfort in the act itself. He told her about the first time he had come to this land, about the wife he had buried beneath the pines, about the silence that had nearly swallowed him whole. And though she could not understand his words, she stayed. One evening, as the sky burned with the colors of a setting sun, Jack sat on the porch, waiting. He did not know if she would come, but he found himself hoping, something he had not done in a long time. And when she emerged from the trees, moving with slow, deliberate steps, he felt something settle inside him, something that whispered of healing, of purpose, of a life that was not yet lost to the wilderness. The wind carried the scent of pine and snow, the last remnants of daylight casting long shadows across the ground. Jack exhaled, watching as the bear settled a few yards away, her great head tilting as if to ask the same question he had been asking himself all along. What now? He did not have an answer. But for the first time in years, he was willing to find out. The first snowfall of December came silently in the night, blanketing the forest in a thick, untouched layer of white. When Jack Turner stepped outside that morning, the world felt softer, quieter, as if the land itself had exhaled and settled into a deep, patient slumber. On the porch of his cabin, his breath curling in slow tendrils against the frozen air, his hands tucked into the deep pockets of his coat, his eyes traced the familiar tree line, searching without searching, expecting without admitting that he was waiting. It had been days since the bear had last appeared, days since she had left her offerings at his doorstep before vanishing into the shadows of the trees, leaving behind only the heavy footprints in the snow and the quiet reminder that something in his life had shifted. He told himself not to think too much about it, not to name whatever fragile thread had formed between them. But the truth settled in his bones, as undeniable as the cold. He missed her. The thought unsettled him, made him shake his head as if he could physically dispel it, as if missing something, someone, was a thing he had long since stopped allowing himself to do. But there it was, unshaken, buried beneath the careful solitude he had built around himself like a fortress. He sighed, stepping down into the snow. His boots crunched through the fresh powder as he made his way toward the traps he had set along the riverbank the day before. The snowfall had been heavier than expected, and he knew he would have to work quickly before the ice thickened and the fish moved deeper beyond his reach. His breath came in slow, rhythmic puffs as he trudged through the knee-high drifts, his movements practiced and efficient. The river was a dark ribbon beneath the ice, barely visible through the cracks where the current still fought against the coming freeze. He knelt at the edge, fingers already numbing as he worked to retrieve his lines, the rope stiff with cold. The first trap was empty, the bait untouched, and he muttered a curse under his breath as he moved to the next. Nothing. His stomach tightened. It had been days since he had caught anything of substance, and his supplies were thinning. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the last line, half expecting it to be the same, but as he pulled, there was resistance. His breath hitched as he tugged harder, the weight of something fighting against the current. A fish. A large one. Relief flooded his chest as he hauled it up through the ice, its body slick and writhing in the cold air, scales glinting beneath the pale morning light. He exhaled, a small, unexpected laugh breaking from his lips. His first real catch in days. But before he could wrap his mind around the small victory, something shifted behind him, a presence. He knew it before he turned, felt it before he heard the slow, deliberate crunch of snow under heavy paws. He turned slowly, heart pounding, and there she was. The bear. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her dark fur dusted with snow, her breath misting in the cold. She was watching him, silent and still, her massive form blending into the trees as if she were a part of them, an extension of the land itself. Jack swallowed, his fingers tightening around the fish in his grip, though he felt no fear. Not of her. Not anymore. She took a step forward, her movements careful, measured. He had never seen a bear move like that before, not with hesitation, not with something that almost resembled intention. She lowered her great head, sniffing the air, her dark eyes flicking between him and the fish in his hands. Jack hesitated. He knew the rules of the wild, knew that giving food so openly could blur the fragile boundaries that separated man from beast, could turn caution into expectation. But this wasn't expectation. This wasn't demand. This was something else entirely. He didn't know how he knew, only that he did. Slowly, he crouched, the cold seeping through the fabric of his pants as he placed the fish onto the snow between them. He kept his movements slow, deliberate, respectful. The bear did not lunge. She did not rush forward in hunger or desperation. She only watched, as if waiting for permission, as if waiting for something beyond food. And then, with the same measured steps, she closed the distance, lowering herself toward the offering with a quiet reverence that sent a strange, unspoken understanding humming through Jack's chest. She took the fish gently, her jaws closing around it with surprising care. Jack let out a slow breath, watching as she lifted her head, chewing slowly. And then something happened that he did not expect. She stepped back. Not away, not into the trees, but just enough to create a space between them. Just enough to acknowledge what had passed between them. It was not just hunger that had brought her here. It was something else. Jack swallowed hard, his throat tight with something he could not name, something that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with what it meant to be seen, to be understood in a way that did not require words. She lingered for a moment longer before turning, moving with the slow, effortless grace of something ancient, something belonging to the land in a way that Jack could never claim to. And then she was gone, disappearing into the quiet white of the forest, leaving Jack kneeling in the snow, staring after her with his heart hammering against his ribs. That night, as he sat by the fire, he could still feel the weight of her gaze, the quiet certainty in her movements. He did not know what it meant, did not know if he was foolish for allowing himself to wonder, but for the first time in years, he felt the absence of something he had not realized he had been missing. Connection. The days stretched on, each morning bringing deeper snow, heavier silence, and a cold that wrapped itself around Jack Turner's cabin like an unrelenting hand. The Alaskan wilderness had always been unforgiving in winter, but this season felt different, colder, lonelier, like the land itself had drawn inward to brace against something unseen. Jack moved through his routines with the same quiet efficiency as always, but there was a shift beneath his skin, something stirring that he couldn't quite name. The bear had not returned for 3 days. He told himself it didn't matter, that he shouldn't have expected anything, that the wilderness had never owed him company. But he found himself glancing toward the tree line more often than he cared to admit. His ears attuned to the smallest sound that might signal her presence. He wasn't sure when the waiting had begun to feel like longing, but the realization sat heavy in his chest as he trudged through the snow toward the river, his breath curling in soft clouds before him. The ice had thickened overnight, forming a slick, glassy surface that reflected the overcast sky in fractured slivers of pale gray. He tested it carefully with the butt of his rifle before stepping forward, listening for the groan of protest beneath his weight. It held. He had no choice but to risk it. The fish he had caught days ago had dwindled, and the hunger in his belly had begun to gnaw at the edges of his patience. Carefully, he knelt at the spot where the current still moved beneath the ice, the trap line stiff with frost as he pulled it from the water. His fingers burned from the cold, but he worked quickly, yanking up the net only to find it empty again. A frustrated breath hissed between his teeth as he reset the line, his mind racing through his options. The snow had buried much of the remaining forage, and the game had grown scarce. If he didn't catch something soon, he'd have to venture farther than he liked. He pushed himself to his feet, his joints stiff from kneeling in the cold, and turned toward the woods, scanning the tree line the way he always did. And then he saw her. The bear. She stood just beyond the first line of pines, her dark fur dusted with fresh snow, her breath rising in slow, steady plumes. Jack's pulse kicked up, not in fear, but in something else. Something like relief, though he didn't want to name it that. She was watching him, unmoving, as if she had been waiting for him to notice her. He had the sudden, unshakable feeling that she had been there for longer than he realized, lingering just out of sight. He exhaled, slow and measured, as he stepped forward, boots crunching in the ice-crusted snow. She didn't flinch, didn't move, but as he closed the distance, something in her posture shifted just slightly, just enough. She turned her great head, and for the first time, he saw what she carried in her jaws. A fish. Fresh. Large. Its scales still wet with the river's cold. Jack froze. His chest went tight with something sharp and unexpected, something that made his fingers twitch at his sides. The bear took a slow step forward, then another, closing the distance between them with deliberate caution. She was close enough now that he could see the frost clinging to her whiskers, the slow rise and fall of her breath. And then, with the same strange, careful gentleness that had marked every encounter before, she lowered the fish onto the snow between them. Jack stared. His throat felt tight, the cold biting at his skin forgotten entirely as he met her gaze, dark and steady and full of something he could not explain. He swallowed hard, then crouched, his fingers hesitating before reaching for the offering. The fish was cold against his palm, its weight solid, real. He exhaled a shaky breath that fogged the space between them, and when he looked up again, the bear had not moved. For a long moment, they only stared at each other, man and beast, the wilderness pressing in around them like a held breath. And then, finally, she turned. Not hurried. Not fearful. Just departing. Jack watched her go, disappearing into the snow-heavy trees, her dark shape swallowed by the hush of the forest. There, long after she was gone, the fish still clutched in his hands, the wind whispered through the pines like something ancient and knowing. That night, as he cooked the fish over the fire, the scent filled the small cabin with warmth. He found himself reaching for something he had not touched in months, a second plate. It was an old habit, one left over from a time when he had not eaten alone. His chest tightened as he stared at it, at the empty space across from him, and he forced himself to breathe, to shake off the weight pressing against his ribs. He wasn't foolish enough to believe that the bear would return simply because he hoped she would, but as he ate, each bite rich and filling in a way that had nothing to do with hunger, he let himself sit with the quiet, let himself feel the strange, undeniable truth settling into his bones. He was not alone. Not entirely. And for the first time in a long time, he was not sure if that terrified him or if it saved him. The wind carried the scent of pine and ice through the trees, threading through the skeletal branches like a whisper, like something half forgotten and half remembered. Jack Turner stood at the edge of the frozen river, his breath misting in slow, measured puffs as he worked to free his trap from the ice, his fingers numb despite the thick wool gloves. The sky had darkened early that afternoon, thick clouds rolling in heavy and low, threatening more snow. He could feel it coming, in the way the air had thickened, in the silence that clung to the forest like a held breath. He had spent enough winters in Alaska to recognize the warning signs. If the storm hit hard, he would be stuck in the cabin for days, maybe longer, and with his supplies already running thin, the timing could not have been worse. He needed to bring back whatever he could, but as he hauled the last of the traps from the ice, he found them empty again. Jack exhaled sharply, frustration curling hot in his chest despite the cold pressing in from all sides. It had been over a week since his last catch, and his body was beginning to feel the effects of hunger, the sluggishness in his limbs, the dull ache behind his ribs. He knew he would have to start rationing more carefully, cutting his portions smaller, stretching what little he had left. He turned, scanning the tree line the way he always did now, though he knew it was foolish to expect her. The bear. He hadn't seen her in days. He told himself it was natural, she was a wild creature, bound to no man, to no unspoken arrangement. And yet, the absence of her presence gnawed at him in ways he didn't fully understand. He had grown used to the quiet exchanges, the shared space, the unspoken understanding that had settled between them like something fragile and unnameable. He had never thought himself the kind of man to long for company, but he could not deny that he had begun to wait for her, to watch for her dark silhouette moving through the snow-laden trees. But she was not here. Not today. Shaking off the thought, Jack turned toward the forest, his steps slow and careful as he moved through the deepening snow, adjusting the rifle slung over his shoulder. If the fish were gone, then he would have to find something else, rabbits, maybe, if he was lucky. But luck had not been on his side for some time now. The weight of the hunger sat heavy in his bones, making each step feel slower, harder. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. He had traveled these woods long enough to know when something felt off, when the silence had shifted into something else. And now, as he paused beneath the skeletal arms of a pine tree, he felt it. The air was different here. Tense. Hushed. He crouched low, scanning the ground, his breath coming in quiet, controlled exhales. Tracks fresh. Not rabbit. Not deer. Larger. The snow had buried some of the details, but he could see the drag marks, the scattered tufts of fur. Something had struggled here. Something had been hunted. His pulse quickened as he followed the trail, his grip tightening around the rifle strap. The deeper he moved into the forest, the more signs of the struggle appeared, blood smudged against the snow, patches of fur clinging to the low branches. And then, through the thick wall of trees, he saw it. A dark shape, half buried in the snow. The bear. Jack's heart slammed against his ribs as he moved forward, his mind already racing through what he might find. As he closed the distance, the details sharpened, her massive body curled inward, her fur matted with ice and blood, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. His stomach twisted. She was hurt. Badly. He hesitated only for a moment before kneeling beside her, his hands hovering just above her, unsure where to touch, where to begin. "Jesus," he breathed, barely a whisper, barely a sound at all. At his voice, dark and glassy, unfocused but aware, she let out a low, pained breath, her body shuddering beneath the effort. Jack's throat tightened as he took in the wounds, deep gashes along her side, the raw, torn skin at her shoulder. Claw marks. Not from another bear. Something else. Wolves. His jaw clenched. He had seen the way wolves hunted, the way they worked together to bring down something larger than themselves. She must have fought them off, must have driven them away before they could finish what they started. But at what cost? He could see the exhaustion in her, the weight of it dragging her closer to the edge of something irreversible. She would not survive another night out here. Not like this. Jack swallowed hard, already making the decision before his mind had fully caught up. Carefully, he moved beside her, his hands pressing against the cold, blood-matted fur at her side. "All right, girl," he murmured, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "We're going to get you out of here." She didn't resist when he shifted her weight, didn't fight when he braced his arms beneath her and hauled her upright as best he could. She was heavy, nearly impossible to move, but Jack gritted his teeth and pushed forward, dragging her through the snow one step at a time. The cabin was too far. He wouldn't make it before dark, and she wouldn't make it through another freezing night out here in the open. The cave. It was closer. He had found it months ago while scouting, a small hollow tucked into the hillside, protected from the worst of the wind. It would have to do. His muscles burned with the effort as he moved, each step slow and deliberate, the weight of her body threatening to pull him down with every labored breath. The bear let out a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whimper, but she did not fight him. He spoke to her as he went, his voice low and steady, though he wasn't sure if it was for her benefit or his own. "You're all right," he muttered, adjusting his grip. "You're going to be all right." By the time they reached the cave, Jack could barely feel his hands, his legs trembling with exhaustion. He lowered her carefully onto the dry stone floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The bear stirred slightly, her sides heaving, but she did not move beyond that. He needed to clean the wounds. To stop the bleeding. Before it was too late. He tore off his gloves, fingers shaking as he pulled the small first aid kit from his pack. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. Working by the dim light of the fading day, Jack did what he could. He cleaned the worst of the wounds, pressing strips of cloth against the bleeding gashes, whispering quiet reassurances whenever the bear stirred. She did not lash out, did not fight. She only watched him through half-lidded eyes, her breath slow, deliberate. He didn't know if it was trust or exhaustion that kept her still, but he didn't question it. Hours passed before he finally leaned back, his hands covered in blood, his body aching with the weight of what he had done. He exhaled shakily, staring down at her, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. She was still alive. That was enough for now. He settled himself near the entrance of the cave, rifle within reach, his own exhaustion threatening to pull him under. The wind howled outside, the storm moving in faster than he had expected, but in the shelter of the cave, it was quiet. He glanced at the bear, at the way she lay curled against the stone, the way her breathing remained steady, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something that was neither hunger, nor exhaustion, nor grief. He felt purpose. The storm came in the night, sweeping through the valley in thick, relentless waves of wind and ice, sealing the world in silence beneath its weight. Jack Turner sat near the mouth of the cave, his body sore, his hands raw from hours of work, but he did not sleep. The fire he had built crackled weakly, throwing shadows against the stone walls, the light flickering across the bear's still form. She had not moved much since he had treated her wounds, her breath slow but steady, a quiet rise and fall against the cold air. Jack watched her in the dim glow of the flames, exhaustion tugging at the edges of his mind, but he could not look away. He had seen death before, seen the way it crept in slowly, the way it settled into the bones of those who could not fight it off. He had feared for a long time that he had let it settle into himself. But here, in the flickering firelight, with the sound of the storm howling beyond the cave walls, he realized he was fighting against it now in ways he hadn't fought for himself in years. He leaned back against the stone, the weight of his own body unfamiliar, as if he had been carrying something for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. His eyes fluttered closed just for a moment. A breath, soft, barely more than a shift of air, but enough. Jack's eyes snapped open, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle beside him before he realized she was moving. The bear let out a low, rough exhale, her head tilting slightly as her dark eyes blinked open, the firelight catching in their depths. Jack exhaled, slow and careful, his pulse steady but strong. "You're still with me," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse, from the cold. She did not rise, did not shift beyond the slight flick of her ear, but her gaze held his, heavy with something he could not quite name. He had spent his life understanding the land, learning its language through the movement of rivers, the shift of the wind, the tracks left behind in the snow. But this was different. This was something beyond instinct. Beyond survival. She knew him now. And he knew her. Jack reached for the canteen at his side, shaking it slightly to test the weight before unscrewing the cap. "Here," he said, his voice low, coaxing. He poured a small amount of water into his palm, holding it out toward her. The bear did not move at first, her breath still slow, labored. But then, after a moment, she leaned forward, her massive head lowering just enough that her tongue flicked out, lapping at the water with careful, deliberate motions. Jack swallowed, his throat tight, but he did not pull away. He let her take what she needed. When she finally settled back against the cave floor, her eyes fluttering closed once more, Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. The night stretched on, the fire burning low. Jack dozed in short, restless bursts, his body too aware, too tense to fully surrender to sleep. The wind screamed outside, rattling through the trees like a living thing, but inside the cave, it was warm. Safe. He had not felt safe in a long time. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world wrapped in a thick, untouched blanket of white. Jack stepped outside, his boots sinking into the deep drifts, the air sharp with the scent of fresh snow. The sky had cleared, a pale, cold blue stretching endlessly overhead, the mountains standing stark against the horizon. He had survived another night. They both had. He turned back toward the cave, his breath curling in the air, watching as the bear stirred once more, shifting her weight, testing the strength of her limbs. She was still weak, but she was alive. Jack spent the next 2 days tending to her, making sure she ate what little food he could spare, keeping the fire burning through the long, bitter nights. He did not know why he had chosen to stay. There was no logical reason, no survivalist instinct that told him to waste his energy on a wounded bear that might not make it through the week. But he did not leave. He could not leave. Something had changed in him, something deep and quiet, something he had not been willing to look at before. He had spent so many years in solitude, telling himself that it was the only way he knew how to be, that it was easier this way. But it had never been easy. It had only been empty. On the third morning, when Jack stepped outside to check his traps, he heard movement behind him, a slow, deliberate shifting of weight. He turned, his breath catching in his chest as he saw her. The bear was standing. Not fully, not easily, but standing nonetheless, her massive frame steady despite the slow, hesitant sway of her movements. Jack remained still, watching. Waiting. She took a step forward. Then another. A laugh bubbled up in his throat, unexpected, breaking through the cold air like a crack in the ice. "Look at you," he murmured, shaking his head. "You stubborn girl." The bear huffed, something almost amused in the sound, and Jack felt the last of his resolve slip away, felt the final wall he had built around himself crumble into the snow at his feet. He had not thought it possible, had not believed that anything could pull him from the quiet numbness he had wrapped himself in. But she had. Somehow, she had. They left the cave together that afternoon, moving slow, side by side. Jack led the way through the deep snow, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his steps careful but sure. The bear followed, her pace unsteady but determined. He did not know where she would go, where she belonged beyond this moment, but he knew with certainty that she would find her way. And maybe, just maybe, so would he. When they reached the river, she paused, lifting her great head to sniff at the air, at the wind that carried the scent of the mountain, the distant whisper of the land calling her home. Jack watched her, his chest tight with something like pride, something like loss, something like hope. She turned to him once more, her dark eyes meeting his, and he knew this was goodbye. Stepping back, giving her space, he said, "Go on." His voice was quiet. "You don't owe me anything." The bear studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like something sacred. And then, with slow, deliberate steps, she turned and walked away, her massive form disappearing into the trees, swallowed by the wilderness that had shaped them both. Jack remained by the river for a long time after she was gone, staring out at the ice, at the endless expanse of white. He felt different, lighter, as if something had shifted inside him. Something that had been buried beneath grief and silence and years of solitude. He had come here to disappear, to let the world forget him as he had tried to forget himself. But now, he wasn't so sure. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of pine and snow, of something new and waiting. Jack took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cold. And then, with slow, steady steps, he turned back toward the cabin. Back toward home. In the heart of the wild, where survival often feels like a lonely battle, an unexpected bond can remind us of the profound connections that exist beyond words. This story teaches us that kindness, even in its smallest form, can ripple into something greater. Jack gave when he had little, expecting nothing in return, and in doing so, he found something he didn't realize he had lost: purpose, companionship, and a reason to keep moving forward. The bear, a creature shaped by instinct and struggle, mirrored his journey, showing that trust and understanding can exist even in the most unlikely places. Life often isolates us, whether through grief, hardship, or the weight of our own choices. But moments of connection, no matter how fleeting, remind us that we are never truly alone. This story is about resilience, healing, and the quiet magic of the world when we choose to see it. Thank you for watching and sharing in this journey. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that celebrate the beauty of life, nature, and the bonds that bring us together. See you in the next one.